It begins, as so many tragedies do, not with a bang, but with a whisper. A quiet, almost imperceptible sound that most of us have heard at some point in our lives. The gentle, persistent tap of a warning against the windowpane of our awareness. And like most of us, Mark Reynolds heard it. He simply chose not to open the window. He was 42 years old, a man built of sharp angles and sharper ambitions, with a jawline that looked as though it had been carved by someone who believed softness was a design flaw. His hands were rarely still, always reaching for the next thing. The next email, the next deal, the next validation. He lived in a world of glass and steel, both literally and metaphorically. His corner office on the 37th floor offered a panoramic view of the city he believed he was conquering, one spreadsheet at a time. And in that office, surrounded by the hum of success, he made a choice. A small one. Insignificant, really. The kind of choice we all make when we're tired, when we're distracted, when we believe our own momentum makes us untouchable. He didn't listen. The warning came from his wife, Sarah, 3 nights before everything began to unravel. It was a Tuesday. Rain streaked the windows of their suburban home, blurring the manicured lawns into watercolor smudges of green. Mark sat at the kitchen island, laptop open, the blue light washing the warmth from his face. He was dissecting a quarterly report, his fingers flying across the keys, his mind already 3 steps ahead, anticipating objections, crafting rebuttals, calculating margins. Sarah stood across from him, drying a wine glass with a towel. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the space between them, at the chasm that had been widening for months, measured not in feet but in missed glances, abbreviated conversations, the slow erosion of shared silence. "Mark," she said, her voice soft but firm, "the way you speak to someone you love who is walking toward a cliff you can see but they cannot. You need to stop." His fingers didn't pause. 2 more minutes. "I just need to finish this section." "It's not about the section," she said, placing the glass down with a quiet click that somehow cut through the keyboard's rhythm. "It's about you. You've been home for 40 minutes and you haven't looked at me once. Not really looked. Your eyes scan me like I'm another data point to be processed before you move on to the next task." He finally lifted his gaze, but it was the gaze of a man interrupted, not a man present. "Sarah, I'm under a lot of pressure right now. The Henderson account." "I know about the Henderson account," she interrupted, and there was no anger in her voice, only a profound weariness that was far more devastating. "I've heard about it every night for 6 weeks. I know its revenue projections, its pain points, its timeline. I could probably close the deal myself. What I don't know is how you're feeling. What's happening inside here?" She touched her own chest, over her heart. "You used to tell me. Before the promotion. Before the corner office became more important than the kitchen table." He sighed, a short, impatient exhalation that spoke volumes. "This promotion is why we have this house. Why Liam goes to that school. Why we took that vacation last summer. You wanted these things too." "I wanted a husband," she said quietly. "Not a provider who occasionally visits. There's a difference." He closed the laptop. Not because he was conceding her point, but because the gesture felt like the quickest path back to peace, to the illusion that the conversation was over. "You're right. I'll be more present." He reached across the island and covered her hand with his. His palm was warm, but his touch was transactional, a seal on a promise he had no intention of keeping. "Tomorrow. Starting tomorrow, I'll leave the office by 6. No exceptions." She looked at their joined hands, then back at his face. She saw the sincerity in his eyes. Or rather, she saw the performance of sincerity he had perfected over years of boardroom negotiations. She knew the difference. And in that moment, she issued the warning. Not as an ultimatum. Not as a threat. But as a simple, heartbreaking statement of fact. "Mark, if you don't start listening, to me, to your body, to the part of you that used to love building model airplanes with Liam on Saturday mornings, you're going to lose something you can't get back. And it won't be the Henderson account." He smiled then, a thin, confident curve of the lips. "I'm not going to lose anything, Sarah. I'm building something. For us." She didn't argue. She simply nodded, took her hand from beneath his, and walked out of the kitchen. He watched her go, registered the slump of her shoulders, and felt a flicker of something, guilt, perhaps, or annoyance at the interruption. But the flicker died as quickly as it came. He reopened his laptop. The Henderson account awaited. And Mark Reynolds, master of his domain, did not listen. The next warning came from his body. Thursday morning. He woke before his alarm, a cold sweat plastering his t-shirt to his back. His heart wasn't racing. It was hammering, a frantic, arrhythmic drumbeat against his ribs that felt less like a pulse and more like a distress signal. He sat up slowly, the room tilting at the edges. A pressure bloomed in his chest, not sharp pain, but a deep, insistent weight, as if someone had placed a heavy book over his sternum and was slowly adding volumes. He breathed in shallow and quick. Seconds. He would later count them in his memory. Insufficient. He sat on the edge of the bed, perfectly still, listening to the alarm his own physiology was screaming. This was not indigestion. This was not stress. This was his body, the one entity he had never truly owned but had ruthlessly leased for 42 years, finally demanding its due. It was saying, stop. Pay attention. You are not a machine. And for those 37 seconds, Mark Reynolds actually listened. He felt the truth of it in his marrow. He imagined calling his assistant, canceling his 9 a.m. meeting, driving to the urgent care center 10 minutes away. He imagined the quiet of a waiting room, the relief of handing over responsibility to someone else for just one morning. Then his phone buzzed on the nightstand. A text from his boss, Robert. Henderson team call moved to 8:15. Need your numbers. Critical path. The spell broke. The weight in his chest receded slightly, as these things often do when adrenaline surges to meet a perceived external threat. His heart settled into a steadier, though still elevated, rhythm. The body is a remarkable liar when the mind provides a compelling narrative. And Mark's mind provided one instantly. It was a nightmare. You dreamed you were falling. That's all. You're fine. He stood up. A wave of dizziness washed over him, but he gripped the bedpost and waited it out. When it passed, he took it as confirmation. See? Fine. In the shower, he turned the water scalding hot, letting it beat against his shoulders, trying to steam out the lingering unease. He examined his face in the mirror as he shaved, the slight pallor, the shadows beneath his eyes that no amount of concealer, a trick he'd learned from a junior VP, could fully disguise. He looked tired. But successful people look tired. It was a badge of honor, wasn't it? A testament to the grind. Sarah appeared in the doorway, wrapped in her robe. She took one look at him, really looked, and her face tightened. Are you okay? You look gray. Just tired, he said, not meeting her eyes in the mirror. Big day. Your hands are shaking. He glanced down. She was right. His right hand trembled slightly as he held the razor. He flexed his fingers, willing them still. Caffeine. I'll cut back. She stepped closer, her voice dropping. Last night. This morning. This isn't just tiredness. Please. Call Dr. Evans. Just to be safe. He finished shaving, wiped his face with a towel, and finally turned to her. He kissed her forehead, a gesture that felt both intimate and dismissive. I'll be fine. I promise. Tonight, I'm all yours. No laptop. We'll order that Thai place you love. He saw the doubt in her eyes, the fear she was trying to mask with a nod. But he was already moving past her, toward the closet, toward the armor of his charcoal gray suit. He didn't listen. How could he? Listening would have meant admitting vulnerability. It would have meant acknowledging that the engine he'd been redlining for a decade might finally be seizing. And Mark Reynolds did not do vulnerability. Vulnerability was for people who hadn't yet figured out how the world worked. He had figured it out. The world rewarded output. It rewarded presence. It rewarded the relentless pursuit of more. It did not reward caution. It did not reward rest. It certainly did not reward listening to whispers when there were shouts demanding action. The third warning came from his son. Liam was 9 years old, with his mother's eyes, wide, observant, capable of seeing straight through the facades adults constructed. That afternoon, Mark had promised, for the third time that month, to attend Liam's robotics club demonstration. It was a small thing, really. 20 minutes in the school library. But to Liam, it was a referendum on his father's love. Children measure devotion in presence, not provision. Mark intended to go. He truly did. But at 3:45 p.m., with the demonstration scheduled for 4 o'clock, Robert called an emergency huddle. The Henderson client had new demands. Unforeseen complications. Mark's presence was required. Non-negotiable. He called Sarah from his car, already halfway to the school before the call came in. "I'm so sorry," he said, his voice tight with genuine regret, but regret that was already being rationalized. "It's Henderson. I can't blow this off." Robert made it clear. "I know," Sarah interrupted, her voice flat. "I'll tell him. Tell him I'll make it up to him. This weekend. We'll go to the Science Museum. All day." "He doesn't want the Science Museum, Mark. He wants you at 4 p.m. on a Thursday in the school library." The line went silent for a moment. Then Sarah said, so quietly he almost missed it, "He's going to stop asking." Mark arrived at the office. The emergency huddle was, as he suspected, mostly theater, a performance of urgency to justify the team's exhaustion. They solved the crisis in 20 minutes. By 4:30, Mark was free. The demonstration would still be wrapping up. He could make the tail end. He could see Liam's robot navigate the miniature maze. He could clap. He could be the father who showed up, even if late. But then his assistant handed him a revised proposal that needed his eyes before morning. And the inbox chimed with 17 new messages. And the weight of the day, the real weight, not the phantom chest pressure, settled on his shoulders. Going back out to the car, fighting traffic, walking into a room where his absence had already been noted, it felt like too much. It felt inefficient. He would call Liam later. He would explain. Children understood explanations. That evening, after Sarah had put Liam to bed, she came into the home office where Mark was, predictably, back on his laptop. She didn't speak at first. She simply placed Liam's robot on the desk between them. It was a clumsy thing made of Legos and wires, with googly eyes glued to the front. A small, handwritten note was taped to its side. Mark picked it up. The handwriting was still that of a child. Letters uneven, capitals where lowercase should be. "Dear Dad, I made the robot go straight. It was hard. I kept trying. You said never give up. I didn't give up. I wish you could see. Maybe next time. Love, Liam." Mark read it twice. Something constricted in his throat. He looked up at Sarah, expecting anger. But her face held only a deep, quiet sorrow. "He waited by the door until 4:25, she said. "He kept looking out the window. When I told him you weren't coming, he didn't cry. He just nodded and went upstairs to his room. He worked on the robot for another hour. Made it turn corners. He's a problem solver, Mark. Just like his father." The words were not an accusation. They were a mirror. And in that mirror, Mark saw a man he didn't recognize. A man who broke promises to his 9-year-old son for meetings that could have waited, for emails that would still be there tomorrow, for a version of success that felt increasingly hollow the closer he got to it. For a moment, just a moment, he wavered. He looked at the robot, at the earnestness of the googly eyes, at the vulnerability in his son's handwriting. He felt the weight of all the times he hadn't listened, to Sarah's quiet pleas, to his body's alarms, to the simple, profound need in his child's eyes. He almost said it. The words formed on his tongue. "I'm stopping. I'm stepping back. I'm choosing you." But then his phone lit up. "Robert." A thumbs-up emoji followed by, "Nailed it today. Henderson's in. Drinks at the Standard? 8 p.m. The moment passed. Mark typed a quick reply, "On my way," and closed the laptop. He stood up, kissed Sarah's cheek, a gesture that felt like an apology and an evasion simultaneously, and headed for the door. As he pulled his coat on, he glanced back at the robot on the desk. He didn't listen to what it was telling him. He didn't listen to the silence in the house, heavier than any words. He didn't listen to the faint, fading whisper that said, "This is the moment. This is where you turn back." He walked out into the evening, toward the gleaming lights of the city, toward the celebration of a victory that suddenly felt like a loss. He was 42 years old. He had a beautiful wife who was learning to stop hoping. He had a son who was learning to stop expecting. He had a body sending him urgent telegrams he kept filing away unread. And he had a corner office waiting for him on Monday morning, a throne in a kingdom he was slowly realizing had no inhabitants but himself. He didn't listen. And this is what happened. The unraveling did not begin with a collapse. It began with a thread. A single, almost invisible thread pulled loose from the tapestry of his carefully constructed life. It happened on Friday afternoon, the day after he missed Liam's demonstration. Mark was in his office, finalizing the Henderson contract, a document that would add 7 figures to the company's annual revenue and, not insignificantly, to his own bonus. The sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long, distorted shadows across the polished concrete floor. He felt good. The chest pressure from Thursday morning was a distant memory, dismissed as stress-induced hysteria. He had powered through. He had won. This was what resilience looked like. His assistant buzzed him. "Mark, Robert's on line 2. And, there's a man here to see you. No appointment. Says it's urgent. Name's Daniel Reeves." Mark frowned. He didn't know any Daniel Reeves. "Tell him I'm in the middle of something. Get his number. I'll call back." "He said you'd say that." "He said to tell you he's from the old neighborhood. Maple Street." A cold finger traced its way down Mark's spine. Maple Street. He hadn't heard those words spoken aloud in 25 years. A place he had meticulously excised from his biography, a chapter he had rewritten so thoroughly even he sometimes forgot the original text. He felt a sudden, irrational urge to tell his assistant to have security escort the man off the premises. But curiosity, that most human of weaknesses, got the better of him. Send him in. The man who entered was perhaps 60 years old, with a weathered face and hands that spoke of a life spent in physical labor. He wore a clean but worn flannel shirt and jeans that had seen better days. He didn't look nervous or intimidated by the opulence of the office. He simply looked tired, resigned. "Mark Reynolds," the man said, his voice gravelly but calm. He didn't offer a hand to shake. "You look just like your father. Same eyes." Mark stiffened. "What do you want, Mr. Reeves?" "Daniel's fine. We knew each other once. Briefly." Daniel walked slowly to the window, gazing out at the city Mark had claimed as his own. "Your father built houses, you know. Good, solid houses. Not these glass towers. Real homes. With porches where people could sit and talk to their neighbors. He was proud of that work. Said a man's character was in the corners he cut, or didn't cut." Mark remained seated behind his desk, a fortress of mahogany and authority. "My father's been gone 20 years. I don't see what any of this has to do with me." Daniel turned from the window, his gaze steady. "He didn't cut corners, Mark. Not on the houses. But he cut them on himself. On his family. Same as you're doing." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, faded photograph. He placed it on the desk between them. It showed a younger Mark, no more than 15, standing next to a man who was indeed his mirror image. Same sharp jaw, same intense eyes, but with a weariness around the edges that Mark was only now beginning to recognize in his own reflection. They were standing in front of a half-built house, both holding hammers. Both smiling. It was a smile Mark didn't remember ever wearing. "He talked about you all the time," Daniel said softly. "Said you were going to be something. Something bigger than him. He wanted you to have choices he never had." Daniel's voice caught slightly. The night he died, he'd been working a double shift, ignoring the headaches for weeks. Your mother begged him to see a doctor. He said he couldn't afford the time off. Said the foreman would give his hours to someone else. That night, he was driving home on the interstate. Fell asleep at the wheel. Mark stared at the photograph. He remembered that day. He remembered the hammer in his hand, the smell of sawdust, the rare, uncomplicated pride in his father's eyes. He remembered the phone call 3 days later. He remembered the funeral. He remembered making a silent vow as he stood by the grave. "I will never be like him. I will never let work destroy me. I will build something lasting." He had built something lasting, a gilded cage of his own design. Why are you telling me this? Mark's voice was barely a whisper. Because I was there, Daniel said. I was working that job with him. I saw the headaches. I saw him pop those pills like candy. I heard your mother's voice on the phone, pleading. I didn't say anything. I didn't push him. I figured it was his life, his choices. Daniel's eyes glistened. I've carried that for 20 years. The knowledge that I might have saved my friend if I'd just been brave enough to be a real friend. When I read about your promotion in the business journal last month, saw your face so like his, I knew I had to try with you what I failed to do with him. I had to deliver the message. He placed a small, sealed envelope on top of the photograph. He wrote this the week before he died. Meant to give it to you on your 16th birthday. He never got the chance. I kept it all these years. Figured you'd throw it away if I'd sent it when you were young. Figured maybe now you'd understand. Mark didn't touch the envelope. He couldn't move. The room seemed to tilt, the cityscape outside the window blurring into an indistinct smear of light and ambition. All the warnings converged in that moment. Sarah's quiet sorrow, the hammering of his own heart, Liam's handwritten note, and now this ghost from a past he'd tried to bury. They weren't separate incidents. They were movements in the same symphony of consequence. A symphony his father had conducted to its tragic finale. And Mark, believing himself the composer of a different score, had been following the same melody all along. Daniel Reeves left without another word. The office door clicked shut behind him, a sound as final as a tomb ceiling. Mark sat alone in the gathering dusk, the photograph and the envelope lying between him and the ghost of the man he was becoming. He should have opened it. He should have read his father's words. He should have called Sarah. He should have gone home right then and held his son and told him he was sorry, not for missing a robotics demonstration, but for missing the point of everything. But he didn't. Instead, he did what he had always done when faced with emotional turbulence. He reached for work. He opened the Henderson contract. He began reviewing the clauses, the numbers, the fine print. He let the familiar rhythm of analysis numb the unfamiliar ache in his chest. He told himself he would deal with the envelope later. Tonight. After drinks with Robert. After he celebrated this victory that suddenly tasted like ash. He didn't listen to the most important warning of all, the one that came not from another person, but from the deepest, truest part of himself. The part that remembered building model airplanes with his father on a rainy Saturday afternoon. The part that knew a life measured only in output was no life at all. He stayed in his office until 7:30. He signed the contract. He emailed it to legal. He felt the hollow satisfaction of a task completed. Then he gathered his things, placed the unopened envelope in his briefcase, tucking it beneath folders and files, burying it where it could not demand his attention, and walked out into the Friday night. The elevator descended 37 floors. With each passing floor, Mark Reynolds moved further away from the man he might have been, and closer to the moment of reckoning he had spent a lifetime outrunning. He stepped out into the lobby, into the warm embrace of the city lights, into the final hours of a life he still believed he controlled. He didn't listen. And the consequences, patient and inevitable as gravity, were already in motion. They were not waiting for Monday morning. They were not waiting for a dramatic collapse. They were here. In the space between one heartbeat and the next. In the unopened envelope in his briefcase. In the silence that had settled over his home. In the fragile, beating heart of a man who had mistaken endurance for strength and ambition for purpose. The first thread had been pulled, and the tapestry, so carefully woven over 42 years, was beginning, almost imperceptibly, to come undone. The city embraced him with its usual Friday night energy, a river of headlights flowing toward restaurants and bars, the hum of possibility vibrating through the pavement beneath his polished shoes. Mark walked with purpose, his briefcase heavy not with the signed Henderson contract, but with the unopened envelope resting beneath it like a secret weight. He told himself he would read it later, after drinks, after he'd celebrated properly. There was a sequence to these things, an order. First, the victory. Then, the reflection. He had always believed in sequencing life this way, reward before reckoning, celebration before contemplation. It was how he'd built his career. It was how he'd built his life. And he would soon discover how he would begin to lose it. The Standard was all dark wood and low lighting, the kind of place where deals were sealed with single malt scotch and quiet handshakes. Robert was already at their usual corner table, 2 glasses of Macallan waiting. He stood when Mark approached, clapping him on the shoulder with a force that carried genuine affection beneath its corporate polish. "Henderson's in the bag," Robert said, his eyes gleaming. "Board meeting Monday. They're talking about fast-tracking you for the executive committee." 43 years old, Mark. Youngest member in company history. Mark slid into the booth, the leather sign beneath him. He should have felt elation. This was the milestone he'd been chasing for 15 years. Instead, he felt a strange hollowness, as if someone had carved out his center and replaced it with static. He forced a smile, lifted his glass. "To Henderson. To Henderson." They clinked glasses. The amber liquid burned a clean path down his throat, a sensation he usually welcomed, the sharp punctuation mark at the end of a long week. Tonight, it felt like swallowing fire. Robert launched into stories about the client dinner, the negotiations, the brilliant maneuver Mark had pulled off with the pricing structure. Mark nodded at the appropriate moments, offered the right interjections, performed the role of the triumphant dealmaker. But his mind kept drifting back to the photograph on his desk, the 15-year-old boy with sawdust on his hands and uncomplicated joy in his eyes. How had that boy become this man? When had the pivot happened? Was it when he'd chosen business school over architecture? When he'd accepted the first promotion that required 60-hour weeks? When he'd missed Liam's first soccer goal because of a conference call? There was no single moment. That was the tragedy of it. The erosion had been glacial, imperceptible until the landscape was utterly transformed. "You okay, Mark?" Robert asked, his voice cutting through the fog. "You're quiet." "Just tired," Mark said automatically. The same phrase he'd used with Sarah that morning. The universal solvent for emotional discomfort in the corporate world. Just tired. It explained everything and nothing. Robert studied him for a moment, then nodded knowingly. "Burnout's real. I went through it after the merger. Woke up one morning and couldn't remember my daughter's birthday. Scared the hell out of me." He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Listen, you've earned a break. Take next week off. Seriously. Go to the cabin. Take Sarah and Liam. Unplug completely. No emails. No calls. Henderson's locked in. The world won't end." The offer hung in the air between them, simple and profound. A lifeline thrown by a man who, for all his corporate ruthlessness, understood the cost of the game they played. Mark felt a surge of something, gratitude, perhaps, or the ghost of it. He opened his mouth to accept. To say yes. To choose the cabin over the corner office, his son's laughter over spreadsheet formulas. And then his phone buzzed on the table. A text from his assistant. "Urgent, Henderson Legal just flagged Clause 14B. Need your eyes before Monday. Sorry to bother you on Friday night." Mark stared at the screen. Clause 14B. He'd reviewed it 3 times that afternoon. It was solid. But legal had flagged it. And if legal had flagged it, Robert would need to know. And if Robert needed to know, the weekend would be consumed by conference calls and redline documents. The cabin would have to wait. He looked up at Robert, who had already pulled out his own phone, frowning at a similar message. The moment had passed. The lifeline dissolved into the smoky air of the bar. "Guess the weekend's not quite mine yet," Mark said, forcing a laugh that felt like broken glass in his throat. Robert sighed, rubbing his temples. "These lawyers. Never fails. Right when you think it's over." He signaled the waiter for another round. "One more drink. Then we dive in." "But Mark," he fixed Mark with a look that was startlingly direct. "After this? You take that time. You hear me? This job, it'll consume you if you let it. I've seen it happen. Good men." Hollowed out. "Don't let that be you." Mark nodded. He heard the words. He even understood them. But hearing is not the same as listening. Listening requires surrender, the willingness to let words penetrate the armor we wear against inconvenient truths. And Mark Reynolds' armor was forged from years of believing he was the exception to every rule, the man who could have it all without paying the price everyone else paid. He didn't listen. They drank. They discussed Clause 14b. They drafted responses. The evening bled into night, the bar emptying around them until only the waitstaff remained, moving with the quiet efficiency of people counting minutes until closing. At 11:47 p.m., Mark finally stood, his legs unsteady beneath him. 2 scotches on top of exhaustion on top of whatever was happening beneath his ribs, a low, persistent thrum he'd been ignoring since Thursday morning. "I'm heading out," he said, gathering his coat and briefcase. The envelope inside seemed to pulse against his leg. Robert nodded, already typing on his phone. "Drive safe. Talk Monday." Mark stepped out into the cool night air. The city had quieted, the frantic energy of Friday evening replaced by the subdued hum of Saturday's approach. He stood on the curb, waiting for his Uber, and for the first time all evening he was truly alone with his thoughts. No distractions. No performance. Just the silent company of his own unraveling. He thought of Sarah waiting at home. Not angrily, he knew her too well for that. She would be in bed, pretending to sleep, her body turned away from his side of the mattress. He thought of Liam, asleep down the hall, the robot with its googly eyes sitting on his nightstand like a tiny, silent judge. He thought of the unopened envelope in his briefcase, his father's final words to him waiting in that fragile paper tomb. And he thought of the pressure in his chest, not gone, merely muted by alcohol and adrenaline, a steady, insistent reminder that his body was keeping score even when his mind refused to. The Uber arrived, a silver sedan gliding to the curb. Mark slid into the back seat, gave his address, and leaned his head against the cool window. The driver, a young man with kind eyes and a quiet demeanor, glanced at him in the rearview mirror. "Long week?" the driver asked. Mark almost said yes. Almost launched into the practiced litany of corporate exhaustion. The deals closed, the hours logged, the victories won. But something in the driver's tone, something genuinely human and uncalculated, short-circuited the reflex. "The longest," Mark said softly. And for the first time in years, he meant it not as a badge of honor, but as a confession. The driver nodded slowly, his eyes returning to the road. "I had a friend once. Worked 80 hours a week at a bank. Made great money. Nice car. Fancy apartment." He paused, navigating a turn with practiced ease. Woke up one morning and his wife was gone. Took the kids. Left a note that said, "I needed a husband, not a ghost." He got everything he thought he wanted. Just not the things that mattered. Mark didn't respond. He couldn't. The words landed not as advice or judgment, but as a mirror held up to his own life with devastating clarity. He looked out the window at the passing streets, the darkened storefronts, the occasional pedestrian hurrying home, the warm glow of windows where families were gathered, present and accounted for. He thought of his own home, waiting for him at the end of this ride. Not a sanctuary. Not anymore. Just another location he visited between obligations. The driver pulled into Mark's neighborhood, the streets lined with mature oaks and houses that cost more than his father had earned in a decade. He stopped at the curb. "Be careful with your time," the driver said, his voice gentle. "It's the one thing you can't get back once it's gone." Mark paid the fare, added a generous tip, and stepped out onto the sidewalk. He stood there for a moment, briefcase in hand, looking up at his house. The upstairs light was off, Sarah was asleep. Or pretending to be. The downstairs light glowed softly, a silent invitation to enter a space that no longer felt like his. He walked up the path, each step heavier than the last. He unlocked the door, stepped inside, and was met with silence. Not peaceful silence. The heavy, accumulated silence of words unsaid and moments missed. He placed his keys in the bowl by the door, the same bowl Sarah had bought at a flea market their first year of marriage, painted with clumsy sunflowers that had charmed him then and now seemed to mock him with their faded cheer. He hung his coat. He placed his briefcase by the stairs. He did not open it. He could not bring himself to face the envelope tonight. Tomorrow, he told himself. Tomorrow morning, before anyone else is awake, I'll read it. I'll sit at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and I'll read my father's words. And then I'll change. It was the same promise he'd made to himself 100 times before. The same tomorrow that never quite arrived. He climbed the stairs slowly, each step a negotiation with gravity. His chest ached, not sharply, but with a deep, muscular fatigue that felt like grief wearing a physical costume. He paused outside Liam's room, pushing the door open just enough to see his son sleeping, one arm flung over his head, the robot resting on the nightstand within reach. Mark watched the steady rise and fall of Liam's chest for a full minute, memorizing the rhythm of a piece he had not earned the right to share. Then he closed the door softly and continued down the hall. Sarah was in bed, her back to the door, the covers pulled precisely to her shoulder. He undressed in the dark, moving with the quiet efficiency of a man who had perfected the art of not disturbing a sleeping spouse, a skill born not of consideration, but of avoidance. He slid beneath the covers, the space between them a chasm measured in inches but felt in light years. He lay on his back, staring at the ceiling he had chosen from a catalog 5 years ago when they'd renovated. He thought of the driver's words. Be careful with your time. He thought of Robert's warning. Don't let this job hollow you out. He thought of Sarah's quiet plea at the kitchen island. You're going to lose something you can't get back. He thought of Liam's note taped to the robot. I wish you could see. He had been warned. Repeatedly. By everyone who loved him. By his own body. By a ghost from his past. By a stranger in an Uber. The universe had been remarkably, almost cruelly, generous with its warnings. It had thrown them at him like lifelines tossed to a drowning man. And he had ignored every single one. Sleep did not come easily. When it did, it was not restorative. It was a fever dream landscape where his father's face melted into Liam's, where boardrooms transformed into childhood bedrooms, where contracts were written in his own blood and signed with a trembling hand. He woke at 3:17 a.m., drenched in sweat, his heart hammering against his ribs with the same frantic rhythm from Thursday morning. He sat up slowly, breathing through the panic, waiting for it to pass as it had before. But this time, it didn't pass. The pressure in his chest deepened, spreading down his left arm in a dull, insistent ache that felt less like pain and more like a message being transmitted through his nervous system in a language he was only now learning to understand. This is not a drill. This is not stress. This is your life asking you to pay attention. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, his feet meeting the cool hardwood floor. He needed air. He needed to move. He stood, swaying slightly, and made his way to the bathroom, flipping on the light. The man in the mirror looked gaunt, haunted. Not the Mark Reynolds of the business journals and corner offices. Not the man who commanded rooms and closed deals. Just a frightened man in his 40s, standing in his bathroom at 3:17 a.m., realizing he might be dying and having no one to call. He thought of calling 911. The rational part of his brain, the part that had gotten him through business school and boardrooms, knew that was the correct action. But another part, deeper and more primitive, resisted. Calling an ambulance meant admitting vulnerability. It meant disrupting the carefully constructed narrative of his invincibility. It meant waking Sarah, terrifying her, potentially embarrassing himself if it turned out to be nothing. What if it's just indigestion? What if I go to the hospital and they run tests and find nothing and I've made a scene for nothing? That was the name of the poison coursing through his veins alongside whatever was happening to his heart. Pride, the oldest sin, the most human failing. The belief that we are exceptions to the rules that govern lesser mortals. Mark Reynolds had built his entire identity on that belief. And now, faced with the ultimate equalizer, mortality itself, he could not let it go. He splashed cold water on his face. Looked at himself again in the mirror. The color had returned slightly to his cheeks. The pain had receded to a manageable throb. See? He told himself. You're fine. It's stress. It's exhaustion. You'll rest this weekend. You'll take Robert's advice. You'll go to the cabin. You'll read your father's letter. You'll be present for Liam. You'll hold Sarah and tell her you're sorry. You'll fix this. He turned off the light and walked back to the bedroom. Sarah hadn't moved. He lay down beside her, careful not to disturb the space between them. He closed his eyes and waited for dawn. He didn't listen to the clearest warning of all, the one his own body had screamed at 3:17 a.m. He chose pride over survival, performance over authenticity. The story he told himself about who he was over the truth his body was trying to tell him about who he had become. And the consequences, patient and precise as a surgeon's scalpel, prepared to make their final incision. Morning came softly, the sun filtering through the blinds in pale gold stripes across the bedroom floor. Mark woke at 6 a.m., the hour his body had been trained to rise for 15 years regardless of how little sleep it had received. He felt different. Not better, exactly, but stable. The chest pressure had subsided to a faint echo, the arm ache gone entirely. His mind, ever the opportunist, seized on this improvement as proof he had been right to ignore the alarm. See? False alarm. Just, you're fine. He slipped out of bed carefully, pulling on sweatpants and a t-shirt. He needed coffee. He needed to think. He needed to finally, after all these years, read his father's letter. Downstairs, the house was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant chirping of birds beginning their Saturday routines. He started the coffee maker, the ritual motions comforting in their familiarity, and then retrieved his briefcase from beside the stairs. He placed it on the kitchen island, unzipped it slowly, and removed the folders and files until only the envelope remained. It was smaller than he'd imagined. Plain white, slightly yellowed with age, his name written in a careful, masculine script he barely remembered. Not Mark Jr., not Jr. Just Mark. His father had always insisted on that. You're your own man, he'd say. Not my shadow. Mark traced the letters with his finger. He thought of the man in the photograph. Proud, tired, hopeful. He thought of Daniel Reeves's words. He didn't cut corners on the houses. But he cut them on himself. On his family. Same as you're doing. The coffee maker gurgled its completion. Mark poured a cup black, the heat searing his palms. He carried it to the island, sat on a stool, and stared at the envelope for a full minute. This was the moment. The pivot point. The choice between continuing down the path his father had walked to its tragic end, or stepping onto a different road, one that led back to the kitchen table, back to his son's robotics demonstrations, back to the man he had once intended to become. He took a deep breath. He slid his finger beneath the flap. He began to tear. And then his phone rang. It was Robert. Of course it was Robert. The universe has a cruel sense of timing when we are on the verge of transformation. Mark hesitated, his fingers still caught in the torn envelope. He looked from the phone to the letter. 2 paths. 2 futures. 1 phone call away from each other. He answered. Mark. Robert's voice was tight, stripped of its usual confidence. I just got off the phone with Henderson's CEO. There's been a development. Mark's stomach dropped. What kind of development? His daughter, the one who's been fighting leukemia for 2 years, she took a turn last night. Critical condition. He's pulling out of the deal. Effective immediately. Says he needs to be with his family. Can't focus on business. Mark sat very still. The coffee in his hand had gone cold. But the contract's signed. Legal. Doesn't matter, Robert interrupted, his voice weary. He's invoking the personal hardship clause. We can't fight it. And honestly, we shouldn't. The man's daughter might not make it through the weekend. The pause. Then, quietly, I just came from the hospital. My own daughter, she had a fever last night. Nothing serious. But sitting in that waiting room, watching that man hold his wife while they waited for news. I remembered what you said last month. About never missing Liam's games. Mark couldn't speak. The words lodged in his throat like stones. I'm calling everyone, Robert continued. Telling them to go home. Be with their families. No emails. No calls. Not until Monday at the earliest. And even then, we'll see. Another pause. Mark, I need you to hear this. Really hear it. That deal was worth 7 figures. 7 figures. And it doesn't matter. Not compared to sitting by your child's bedside wondering if they'll open their eyes again. Go be with your family today. Please. Robert hung up. Mark stood in the silent kitchen, the phone still pressed to his ear. The envelope lay torn open on the island, its contents still hidden within. The warning had come not as a whisper this time, but as a thunderclap, a story of a father choosing his dying daughter over a seven-figure deal, delivered by a man who had just been shaken to his core by the fragility of it all. It was the clearest moral lesson imaginable. The universe had not just warned him, it had demonstrated the stakes in real time, with real people, with real consequences. He should have called Sarah. He should have woken Liam. He should have gathered them both in this kitchen and told them he was sorry, that he was changing, that starting today everything would be different. He should have finished opening the envelope and read his father's words. He should have listened, truly listened, to the symphony of warnings that had been playing for days. Instead, he did what he had always done when faced with emotional vertigo. He reached for control. For action. For the illusion that he could manage his way out of a crisis that required not management, but surrender. He called his assistant. Voicemail. He left a message. Need you to pull everything on Henderson's competitors. I want a list of potential replacements by Monday morning. And get legal on the line. I want to know if there's any recourse on that hardship clause. He called the head of sales. Voicemail. Another message. Henderson's out. I know. Don't panic. We pivot. I want every major account reviewed by end of day Sunday. We find a replacement. We don't lose momentum. He called 3 more people. Left 3 more messages. Each call a brick laid in the wall between himself and the truth he was being asked to face. Each message a declaration that the game was not over, that he could still win, that the rules of human fragility did not apply to Mark Reynolds. When he finally hung up for the last time, the kitchen was bright with morning light. The coffee had gone cold. The envelope remained half open, its contents unread. And upstairs, Sarah was awake now. He could hear the floorboards creaking, and Liam would be stirring soon, and the day was unfolding without him as it had for so many days before. He stood to make a fresh pot of coffee. And as he turned from the island, a wave of dizziness washed over him so violently his knees buckled. He caught himself on the counter, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The pressure returned to his chest, not the dull throb of before, but a crushing weight, as if an invisible hand had reached inside his ribcage and was slowly closing its fist around his heart. This time, there was no ambiguity. This time, no room for rationalization. This was not stress. This was not indigestion. This was the consequence he had been warned about, arriving not with drama or fanfare, but with the quiet, inexorable finality of a sentence being carried out. He slid down the cabinet to the floor, his back against the cool wood, his legs splayed awkwardly beneath him. He reached for his phone, his fingers fumbling, the screen blurring before his eyes. He needed to call 911. He needed to call Sarah. He needed to say he was sorry. He needed to say he loved them. He needed to say he should have listened. But his fingers would not cooperate. The phone slipped from his grasp, clattering to the floor just beyond reach. He tried to crawl toward it, but his arms would not hold his weight. The world began to narrow, the edges of his vision darkening like a photograph being developed in reverse. The last thing he saw was the half-open envelope on the kitchen island, his name written in his father's hand. The last thing he heard was footsteps on the stairs, Sarah's voice calling his name, sharp with concern. The last thing he felt was regret, not for the missed deal, not for the corner office, but for every moment he had chosen the illusion of control over the messy, beautiful reality of connection. He didn't listen. And as the darkness closed in, complete and absolute, Mark Reynolds finally understood the terrible, beautiful truth he had spent a lifetime avoiding. The warnings were never about preventing the fall. They were about who would be there to catch you when you fell. And he had spent so long pushing everyone away, his wife, his son, his own body's wisdom, that when the moment came, there was no one left to break his landing. The footsteps reached him. Sarah's voice, now screaming his name. Hands on his shoulders, his face. The distant wail of a siren that might have been real or might have been the sound his own heart made as it began to fail. He didn't listen. And this gasping on a kitchen floor, this terror in his wife's eyes, this race against a clock he could no longer control, this was what happened. The world did not go black. That was the first surprise. Darkness would have been a mercy, a clean severing of consciousness, a narrative punctuation mark. Instead, the world fractured into shards of sensation, each one sharp and distinct and impossible to ignore. The cold press of tile against his cheek. The coppery taste of blood where he'd bitten his tongue. The weight of Sarah's hands on his shoulders, shaking him gently at first, then with mounting desperation. Her voice, usually so measured, so careful with its words, now stripped bare of everything but raw, animal fear. Mark, look at me. Look at me. He tried to obey. He willed his eyes to focus on her face hovering above him, but the edges kept dissolving into static. He saw her mouth moving, forming words he could not decipher through the roaring in his ears, a sound like a distant freight train gathering speed. He tried to speak, to form the 3 words that had been lodged in his throat for months, for years. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. But his lips would not shape them. His tongue was a stone in his mouth. The crushing pressure in his chest had transformed. It was no longer a weight. It was a fire. A white-hot forge burning at the center of him, radiating waves of agony down his left arm, up into his jaw, a pain so absolute it felt less like a symptom and more like a reckoning. His body was no longer a vessel he piloted with detached efficiency. It was a traitor, a prosecutor, a witness stand upon which every ignored warning, every dismissed symptom, every sacrificed moment with his son was now being presented as evidence against him. Sarah's hands left his shoulders. He heard the frantic stab of buttons on a phone. Her voice, high and tight. 911, yes, my husband, he's having a heart attack, 42 years old, chest pain, can't speak. The words came in gasps, each one a tiny fracture in the composed woman he had married. He had never heard her sound like this. Not when she'd miscarried their second child. Not when her father died. This was different. This was the sound of a foundation cracking beneath her feet. He wanted to tell her he was okay. That it was just stress. That he'd be fine after a nap. The old lies rose to his lips by reflex, the scripts he'd performed so many times they'd become his native language. But his body would not let him speak them. His body was finally, after 42 years of being treated as a mere instrument of ambition, demanding to be heard. And what it was saying was simple, brutal, and irrefutable. You are not fine. You are not invincible. You are dying. The distant wail he'd heard as consciousness faded was not his imagination. It grew louder, resolving into the Doppler-shifting scream of an ambulance tearing through a Saturday morning that had begun with sunlit promise. He heard the front door burst open, not the gentle click of a key in a lock, but the violent intrusion of emergency. Heavy boots on hardwood. Voices, calm and practiced, cutting through Sarah's sobs like scalpels. Ma'am, step back please. We've got him. Hands, gloved, competent, utterly impersonal, rolled him onto his back. A mask pressed against his face. The sudden rush of oxygen was a shock, a cold river flooding his starved lungs. He tried to focus on the paramedic's face above him, a young woman with a no-nonsense ponytail and eyes that held neither judgment nor pity, only focused intent. She was not seeing Mark Reynolds, senior vice president, corner office occupant, Henderson deal closer. She was seeing myocardial infarction. Patient male, 42. Critical. Her gaze moved over him with the detached assessment of a mechanic diagnosing an engine failure. And in that gaze, he felt something he had not felt in decades. Insignificance. Not humiliation. Not shame. Just the quiet, humbling truth that at the precipice of death, titles and salaries and corner offices evaporated like mist. All that remained was a body failing, and the hands trying to save it. BP's 80 palp, the paramedic said to her partner, her voice crisp. Starting in 4. Nitro under the tongue. We need to move. They lifted him onto a backboard, the straps clicking into place with terrifying finality. As they carried him through his own home, the home he had provided but rarely inhabited, he saw it all with the hyperclarity of a man viewing his life through the wrong end of a telescope. The kitchen island where he'd torn open his father's envelope only partially before answering Robert's call. The briefcase by the stairs, still holding the unread letter. The family photos on the mantel, Sarah and Liam smiling on a beach vacation he'd spent half of on conference calls. Every object in the room had become an indictment. Not because they were beautiful or expensive, but because they represented a life he had been physically present for but emotionally absent from. He had built this stage meticulously. And now, as they carried him toward the exit, he realized he had never actually stepped into the role of husband, of father. He had been a producer watching from the wings, forever distracted by the next project, the next deal, the next validation. They loaded him into the ambulance. The doors slammed shut, sealing him in a mobile chamber of blinking lights and beeping machines. Sarah climbed in beside him, her face pale, her hand finding his. Her fingers were ice cold. He tried to squeeze back, to offer some semblance of comfort, some signal that he was still in there, still fighting, but his hand remained limp in hers. The shame of that failure was almost as acute as the pain in his chest. To be carried away from his own home, helpless, while the woman he loved looked at him with terror in her eyes. This was the cost. This was the interest accrued on decades of compound neglect. The ambulance lurched into motion. Sirens wailed. Through the small window behind the driver's compartment, he watched his neighborhood blur past, the manicured lawns, the identical luxury sedans in driveways, the American dream in subdivisions. How many men in those houses, he wondered, were making the same calculations he had? Trading presence for provision. Sacrificing connection for career advancement. Believing the lie that they could always make it up later, that there would always be a tomorrow to be the husband, the father, the human being they claimed to want to be. How many of them were one ignored warning away from their own kitchen floors? Sarah's voice cut through his thoughts, soft but urgent. Stay with me, Mark. Just stay with me. Look at me. He turned his head slightly, the movement costing him dearly. Her eyes were red-rimmed but dry now, the initial shock giving way to a fierce, focused determination. This was the Sarah he had fallen in love with, the woman who did not crumble under pressure but met it with a quiet, unshakable strength. He had forgotten that strength existed. He had been so busy seeing her disappointment, her sadness, her withdrawal, that he had missed the bedrock beneath it all. And now, as he lay dying in the back of an ambulance, that bedrock was the only thing keeping him tethered to the world. I should have listened, he whispered. The words were barely audible, shredded by pain and oxygen mask, but she heard them. Her grip on his hand tightened. What, Mark? What should you have listened to? Everything, he breathed. All of it. The ambulance swerved into the emergency bay of Memorial Hospital, a place he had driven past 1,000 times, always as a spectator to other people's emergencies. Now he was the emergency. They unloaded him with practiced efficiency, wheels screaming against linoleum as they raced down a corridor that smelled of antiseptic and dread. Nurses materialized like ghosts in scrubs, their movements a choreographed ballet of crisis response. A doctor with tired eyes and a stethoscope around his neck barked orders. Get him to Cath Lab 3. Page Dr. Chin. Tell her we've got a STEMI, male, 42, door-to-balloon time under 20 minutes if we move. Hands transferred him from gurney to procedure table. Cold gel on his chest. The sharp pinch of more needles. A mask replaced the oxygen, this one carrying something stronger, something that began to pull the edges of the pain into a soft, distant haze. He was floating now, the fire in his chest receding to a dull ember. He felt Sarah's hand slip from his as a nurse gently guided her away. You can wait in the family area, ma'am. We'll update you as soon as we know anything. No, Sarah said, her voice firm despite its tremor. I'm staying until he's stable. He needs to see my face when he wakes up. The doctor hesitated, then nodded curtly. 5 minutes. Then you have to go. Sarah moved to the head of the table, her face filling his narrowing field of vision. She brushed the hair from his forehead, a gesture so tender it shattered something inside him. You're going to be okay, she said, and for the first time, he heard the plea beneath the declaration. She wasn't stating a fact. She was praying it into existence. But Mark, when you wake up, promise me something. He tried to nod. Couldn't. Managed a faint squeeze of his eyes. Once for yes. Promise me you'll listen this time. Not just hear. Not just say you'll change. Really listen. To your body. To Liam. To me. To whatever truth you've been running from. Her voice broke on the last word. I can't lose you. But I can't keep living with the ghost of you either. Do you understand? He understood. With a clarity that cut through the morphine haze, he understood completely. She wasn't asking him to survive. She was asking him to come back. To truly come back. To trade the ghost he'd become for the man she'd married. The stakes had never been this clear. Life or death was the physical equation. But the deeper equation, the one that would determine whether survival meant anything at all, was presence or absence. Connection or isolation. Listening or deafness. He tried to form the word yes. Couldn't. So he did the only thing his broken body would allow. He held her gaze. And in that gaze, he poured every ounce of his regret, his love, his dawning comprehension. He let her see the man beneath the wreckage, the boy who'd built model airplanes with his father, the young husband who'd painted their first apartment with Sarah while dancing to terrible pop music, the new father who'd wept with awe the first time Liam had gripped his finger. He let her see that man was still in there. Buried but not dead. Sarah saw it too. He watched the recognition dawn in her eyes, the faint, fragile hope that this might not be an ending, but a brutal, necessary beginning. Then the medical team gently but firmly guided her away. The table began to move. The ceiling tiles blurred above him. The last thing he saw before the drugs pulled him under was not a face or a light or a memory. It was the half-open envelope from his kitchen island, superimposed on the sterile white tiles. A ghost of a warning finally arriving too late to prevent the fall, but perhaps, just perhaps, in time to shape the landing. Consciousness did not return gently. It slammed into him like a fist. A searing pain radiated from his groin upward, grotesque, humiliating, utterly disorienting. He tried to sit up, to escape the violation, but strong hands pressed him back against the bed. Easy now, Mr. Reynolds. You're in recovery. The catheter's necessary. It'll be removed soon. A nurse, different from the paramedic, older, with kind eyes and silver streaks in her hair, adjusted a bag hanging from a pole beside him. He was in a small room, dimly lit, machines beeping a steady, reassuring rhythm beside him. The fire in his chest had been extinguished, replaced by a deep, muscular soreness, as if he'd been trampled by horses. He was alive. The thought arrived not as joy, but as sheer, staggering disbelief. Sarah was in a chair beside the bed, asleep upright, her head tilted at an awkward angle, one hand still resting on the sheet near his hip. She looked exhausted, her face stripped of makeup, the fine lines around her eyes more pronounced in the low light. But she was there. She hadn't left. The simple fact of her presence felt like a miracle he had not earned. He tried to speak. His throat was sandpaper. The nurse noticed him stirring and brought a cup with a straw. Small sips, she instructed. You've been through quite an ordeal. The water was the most beautiful thing he had ever tasted. Life itself, distilled to its essence. He drank greedily until she gently pulled the cup away. Dr. Chen will be in shortly to discuss the procedure. You had a significant blockage in your left anterior descending artery, the widowmaker, we call it colloquially. We placed 2 stents. You're lucky your wife got you here when she did. Another 15 minutes. She let the sentence hang, her meaning clear. But the word echoed in the hollow space inside him. Was he lucky? Or had he simply been granted a reprieve, a second chance purchased with terror and trauma? Luck implied randomness. This felt like consequence. The direct, logical outcome of choices made and warnings ignored. There was nothing random about it. He had built this heart attack with his own hands, one missed dinner, one ignored symptom, one prioritized email at a time. The door opened softly. A woman in her late 50s entered. Dr. Chin, he assumed. She carried a tablet and an air of calm authority that immediately inspired trust. She didn't smile. She didn't offer empty reassurances. She simply pulled up a stool beside his bed, met his eyes directly, and began to speak. I'm Dr. Chin. I performed your angioplasty this morning. She tapped her tablet, and an image appeared, a ghostly X-ray landscape of arteries, with two bright white stents glowing like beacons in the darkness of a blocked vessel. This is your heart. Or rather, the plumbing of it. This artery here, she pointed with a stylus, was 90% occluded, completely choked with plaque. At your age, that's not typical. It's not just genetics or bad luck. It's lifestyle, chronic stress, poor sleep, likely poor diet. The body keeps score, Mr. Reynolds. It always keeps score. He tried to speak, to explain himself, to offer the justifications he'd built his life upon. The Henderson account. The promotion. Providing for my family. But the words died before they reached his lips. What justification could possibly hold weight against this image? Against the stark reality of a heart literally clogged with the residue of a life mislived? Dr. Chen seemed to read his thoughts. I'm not here to judge you, she said, her voice softening slightly. I've seen your type before. Ambitious. Driven. Convinced you're the exception to the rules that govern mere mortals. She leaned forward slightly. Let me be perfectly clear. There are no exceptions. Your heart doesn't care about your title. Your arteries don't respond to your bonus. Your body is not a machine you can redline indefinitely without consequence. It is a living, breathing ecosystem. And you've been poisoning it with stress hormones for years. She paused, letting the truth settle. You survived today. But survival is not the same as healing. The stents will keep the artery open. But they won't fix what caused the blockage in the first place. That part is entirely up to you. She stood to leave, then turned back at the door. One more thing. The average recovery time for someone with your procedure is 6 to 8 weeks. But I'm not talking about physical recovery. I'm talking about the recovery of your life. The real work begins when you walk out of this hospital. Will you go back to the same patterns that put you here? Or will you finally listen to the body that just saved your life by screaming at you until you collapsed? She left without waiting for an answer. She didn't need one. The question hung in the room like incense smoke, visible, fragrant with truth, impossible to ignore. Sarah stirred awake then, her eyes fluttering open. She saw him looking at her, truly seeing her, and a sob escaped her lips before she could stop it. She stood and moved to the bedside, her hands fluttering over him as if afraid to touch, afraid he might dissolve. You're awake, she whispered. I'm here, he said, his voice raspy but clear. And for the first time in years, perhaps for the first time since he'd taken the promotion that began this slow unraveling, he meant it. Not physically present, not occupying space, but here, awake, aware, terrified, remorseful, human. Tears streamed down Sarah's face, but she was smiling now, a fragile, watery smile that held both grief and hope in equal measure. You scared me, she said simply. I know, he whispered. I'm sorry. This time, the words weren't a reflex. They weren't a transaction designed to end an uncomfortable conversation. They were an offering, a surrender, the first honest words he'd spoken to her in months. She took his hand, the one not tethered to 4 lines, and pressed it to her cheek. Her skin was warm, damp with tears. Present. They sat like that for a long time, the machines beeping their steady rhythm, the morning light strengthening through the blinds. No words were needed. The silence between them was no longer heavy with absence. It was soft with possibility. After a while, Sarah spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. Liam's at my sister's. I didn't want him to see. I didn't want him to be scared. Mark's throat tightened. His son. The boy with the robot and the googly eyes and the heartbreaking note. The boy who had stopped expecting his father to show up. He should know I'm okay, Mark said. Can you bring him? When he's ready. Sarah nodded, her eyes glistening. He asked about you this morning. Before I left. He said, is Dad going to be okay? I told him yes. I had to believe it to say it. Mark closed his eyes. The image of Liam's face, worried, waiting, was more painful than the catheter, more searing than the memory of chest pain. He had taught his son to build robots that never gave up. And in doing so, he had inadvertently taught him that fathers sometimes gave up on showing up. The irony was a knife twisting in his gut. "I need to read it," he said suddenly, his eyes opening. Sarah looked confused. "Read what?" "The letter. My father's letter. It's in my briefcase. At home." Understanding dawned on her face. She nodded slowly. "I'll get it. After I see Liam." "No," he said, surprising himself with the firmness in his voice. "Not yet. I need to be ready to hear what it says. I need to be someone who can actually listen." Sarah studied him for a long moment, as if seeing him for the first time since he'd woken up. And what she saw must have been different from the man who'd left for work on Thursday morning. Because she nodded again, this time with something like respect in her eyes. "Okay," she said softly. "When you're ready." She stayed with him until the nurse came to remove the catheter, a humiliating, painful process he endured with clenched teeth and averted eyes. When it was over, he was exhausted, drained to his core. But beneath the exhaustion was something new. Something fragile but undeniable. A quiet. Not the heavy silence of avoidance that had filled his home for months, but the peaceful quiet of a storm passing, of wreckage assessed, of the long, hard work of rebuilding about to begin. Sarah kissed his forehead as she prepared to leave and collect Liam. "I'll be back in a couple hours. Rest." He closed his eyes as she left, the room settling into a soft hum of machines and distant hospital sounds. He was alone again. But this time, the aloneness did not feel like isolation. It felt like space. Room to breathe. Room to feel. Room to finally, after a lifetime of running, sit with the truth of who he had become, and who he might still become. He thought of the warnings. Sarah's quiet plea at the kitchen island. The hammering of his own heart at 3:17 am. Liam's note taped to the robot. Daniel Reeves's visit with the photograph and the unopened envelope. Robert's advice to take time off. The Uber driver's wisdom about time being the one thing you can't get back. Dr. Chen's stark diagnosis. The body keeps score. He had been warned. Repeatedly. Generously. Almost miraculously. The universe had not been cruel. It had been patient. It had given him chance after chance after chance to change course. And he had ignored every single one. But here was the grace he had not expected, the mercy he had not earned. The warnings had not stopped when he collapsed. They had simply changed form. The warning was no longer a whisper meant to prevent the fall. It was now the steady beep of a heart monitor, a reminder that he was still here. It was the soreness in his chest, a testament to survival. It was Sarah's tears, a mirror reflecting the cost of his absence. It was the unopened letter waiting at home, a bridge to a past he had tried to bury, now offering a path to a different future. He had not listened before. That was the fact of his life up to this moment. Unchangeable, irrevocable, a truth he would carry with him always. But the future was not written yet. And as he lay in that hospital bed, the ghost of his father's handwriting waiting in an envelope at home, the memory of his son's worried face burning behind his eyes, the feel of his wife's hand still warm on his skin, he made a promise not to the universe, not to God, not to some abstract concept of redemption. He made a promise to himself. The next warning would not go unheard. The next whisper would not be dismissed. The next chance, this fragile, hard-won second chance, would not be wasted. He closed his eyes. Not to sleep, but to listen. For the first time in his life, truly listen. To the rhythm of his own heart, beating, beating, beating. A second chance measured out in steady, miraculous pulses. And beneath that rhythm, quieter but no less real, the faint, persistent whisper of a life waiting to be lived. Not built. Not achieved. Not conquered. But lived. Fully. Messily. Presently. He didn't know if he could do it. The habits of a lifetime don't dissolve with a single heart attack. The architecture of a life built on performance doesn't crumble overnight. But for the first time, he was willing to try. Not because he wanted to avoid another collapse, but because he finally understood what he stood to gain. Not a bigger office. Not a larger bonus. But a hand to hold in a hospital room. A son who still believed his father might show up. A wife who, despite everything, had not let go. This was what happened when he didn't listen. And this fragile, terrifying, beautiful awakening, this was what happened after. The beginning of listening. Part 4. The days in the hospital unfolded with the strange rhythm of institutional care. A cycle of vital checks, medication schedules, and brief visits from specialists who spoke in the measured tones of people who had seen too many men like Mark brought to this precipice. He was moved from recovery to a private room on the cardiac floor, a space that quickly accumulated the artifacts of a life interrupted, get-well cards from colleagues whose names he barely remembered, a wilting bouquet of flowers from Robert with a note that read simply, "The cabin can wait. Your family can't," and most precious of all, a drawing from Liam taped to the wall beside his bed. It was a crayon rendering of 3 stick figures holding hands beneath a lopsided sun. The tallest figure wore a tie. The smallest held a robot with unmistakable googly eyes. Between them stood a woman with long brown hair and a smile that took up half her face. At the bottom, in the careful printing of a child who was still mastering lowercase letters, were the words, "Get well, Dad, I built a new robot, it goes in reverse now. Love, Liam." Mark studied that drawing for hours, his finger tracing the waxy lines as if they contained a map back to himself. He had missed so much. Not just robotics demonstrations and soccer games, but the subtle evolution of his son's mind, the problem-solving that had progressed from making a robot go straight to making it reverse. That was growth. That was life happening in real time. And he had been absent for it, trading these irreplaceable moments for conference calls that would be forgotten by Monday, for deals that collapsed overnight, for a version of success that had nearly cost him everything that actually mattered. Sarah visited daily, sometimes with Liam in tow, sometimes alone. The visits with Liam were tender but strained, the boy hovering near the door, his eyes wide with a mixture of worry and something else Mark couldn't quite name until he recognized it: uncertainty. His son wasn't sure who this vulnerable, pale man in the hospital bed was. The father Liam knew was a force of nature, always moving, always speaking on phones, always half present even when physically in the room. This quiet, still man who asked gentle questions about school and robots and friends was unfamiliar territory. Mark felt the chasm between them like a physical ache, deeper than any surgical wound. But Sarah was different. The guardedness that had settled over her like a second skin in recent months had softened. Not disappeared, too much damage had been done for that, but softened, like frost melting under a tentative sun. She brought him books from home. She sat with him in comfortable silences that no longer felt heavy with accusation. She held his hand while he slept, her presence a quiet anchor in the sterile sea of the hospital room. On the 3rd day, she arrived alone, carrying his briefcase. "I thought you might be ready," she said simply, placing it on the chair beside his bed. She didn't open it. She didn't press him. She simply sat on the edge of the bed, took his hand and waited. Mark looked at the briefcase, the same one he'd carried into the Standard for drinks with Robert just 4 days ago, a lifetime ago. Inside lay the signed Henderson contract, now meaningless. Inside lay folders of emails that would never be answered. And inside, nestled beneath the detritus of a life he was shedding like a snake sheds skin, lay the envelope from his father. He took a slow, deliberate breath, the deep breathing exercises the cardiac rehab nurse had taught him already becoming habit. "Will you stay?" he asked. "While I read it?" Sarah nodded, her eyes glistening. "I'll be right here." He unzipped the briefcase with trembling hands, removed the folders one by one, placing them on the bedside table as if performing a ritual of purification. And there it was. The plain white envelope, slightly yellowed, his name written in the careful script he remembered from birthday cards and report card signatures long ago. He picked it up. The paper was fragile, the edges soft with age. He finished tearing the flap he'd started that Saturday morning before Robert's call had interrupted him, the call about a father choosing his dying daughter over a 7-figure deal. The irony was not lost on him. His father's final words had waited 25 years to be read, only to be delayed one final time by a story that mirrored their very message. He slid out the single sheet of paper inside. The handwriting was his father's, strong, masculine, with the slight slant of a man who wrote with purpose. If you're reading this, I'm gone. And if I'm gone, it probably happened the way I always feared, working myself into an early grave because I was too proud to admit I was human. Don't hate me for that. Hate the example I set. Then do better. I spent my life building houses for other people's families while neglecting my own. I told myself it was for you, that the overtime, the missed dinners, the headaches I ignored were investments in your future. But the truth is simpler and uglier. I was running from the quiet. From the terrifying vulnerability of just being a father, just being a husband, without the armor of productivity. Work was easier than presence. Providing was simpler than connecting. And so I chose the easier path. And it killed me. Don't make my mistake, son. The houses I built will stand for decades. But what will my son remember of me? A man who came home too tired to talk? Who missed his little league games because of important meetings? Who taught him, through absence, that success matters more than love? I want you to have choices I never had. Go to college. Wear a suit if that's your calling. Make more money than I ever dreamed. But for God's sake, don't let the suit become your skin. Don't let the corner office become your home. Don't let the pursuit of a life worth living blind you to the life you're actually living. The greatest legacy a man can leave isn't in his bank account or his title. It's in the quiet moments he showed up for. The bedtime stories read with patience. The scraped knees kissed better. The conversations had without glancing at a watch. These are the things that build a son's understanding of what it means to be a man. Not the size of his paycheck. The depth of his presence. I failed at this. I know that now, lying here with this headache that won't quit, knowing I should see a doctor but telling myself I can't afford the time off. I'm writing this as a confession and a plea. Don't follow my blueprint. Burn it. Build something new. Something with room for joy. For rest. For love. Be the father I couldn't be. Not because I wasn't trying, but because I was listening to the wrong voices. The boss who demanded overtime, the foreman who valued output over humanity, the voice in my own head that equated busyness with worth. Listen to your wife. Listen to your children. Listen to your body when it whispers before it screams. And most of all, listen to the quiet voice inside that knows, really knows, what matters. I love you, Mark. More than any house I ever built. More than any deal you'll ever close. More than anything. Mark read the letter once. Then again. By the third reading, tears streamed freely down his face, dripping onto the fragile paper, blurring the ink in places. He didn't try to stop them. He let them fall. He let the grief move through him, not just grief for his father, but grief for the 25 years he'd spent running from this very message, only to arrive at the same precipice through different means. He had worn a suit instead of work boots. He had negotiated contracts instead of framing houses. But the blueprint had been the same. The same pride. The same deafness to the whispers before they became screams. The same tragic miscalculation that provision could substitute for presence. Sarah didn't speak. She simply moved closer, her arm around his shoulders, her cheek resting against his temple. She let him weep. She let him grieve. She held space for the collapse of a lifetime of carefully constructed defenses. When the tears finally subsided, leaving him hollowed out but strangely lighter, he looked at her, truly looked at her, and said the words he should have said months ago, years ago. I don't want to be him, Mark whispered, his voice raw. I don't want to be my father. And I don't want Liam to grow up thinking this. He gestured weakly at the hospital room, at the tubes and monitors tethering him to life. Is the price of success. Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but she smiled, a real smile this time, reaching her eyes. You're not him, Mark. You're here. You're reading his words. You're feeling this. He never got the chance to do any of that. You're already different. But I was on the same path, he insisted, the fear sharp in his throat. I missed Liam's demonstration. I ignored chest pain. I chose a drink with Robert over reading this letter. I was him, Sarah. I was exactly him. You were on the path, she corrected gently. But you didn't reach the end. That's the difference. You got a warning. A brutal, terrifying warning. And you're listening now. That's what matters. Not that you stumbled, but that you're getting up. She took the letter from his trembling hands, folded it carefully, and placed it back in the envelope. This isn't a condemnation, Mark. It's an inheritance. Your father's greatest gift to you wasn't the work ethic he instilled. It was this letter, his final attempt to break the cycle. He couldn't save himself, but he tried to save you. Honor that. Don't by becoming him. By becoming someone new. Mark closed his eyes, her words settling deep in the newly softened soil of his heart. An inheritance. Not of guilt or shame, but of hard-won wisdom purchased with a life. His father's death had not been meaningless. It had been a sacrifice, a brutal, unintended sacrifice, that had planted a seed of warning meant to blossom 25 years later in a hospital room where his son lay recovering from the same failure to listen. He was not his father, but he carried his father's lesson in his very bloodstream, the plaque in his arteries a physical manifestation of inherited patterns, the letter in his hands a spiritual antidote. He could not change the past. He could not undo the missed moments, the ignored warnings, the slow erosion of his marriage. But he could choose, starting now in this hospital bed, with this letter in his hands and this woman beside him, to build something new. The discharge came on a Tuesday morning, 6 days after the heart attack. Dr. Chen reviewed his instructions with the no-nonsense clarity that had earned Mark's trust. 6 weeks of cardiac rehabilitation. No driving for 2 weeks. Absolutely no work emails, no calls, just checking in with the office. A strict diet. Daily walks that would gradually increase in duration. And most importantly, a referral to a therapist specializing in type A personality restructuring, as she put it with a wry smile. The stents will keep your arteries open, she said, her gaze steady. But only you can keep your life open. Don't waste this second chance, Mark. People die waiting for one. Sarah drove him home. The familiar streets felt foreign, as if he were returning from a long war in a country no one else could see. When they pulled into the driveway, he sat for a long moment, staring at the house that had been both sanctuary and prison. He was afraid to go inside. Afraid the ghost of the man he'd been would rise to meet him in the foyer, would whisper in his ear that this was all temporary, that soon he'd be back on the treadmill of ambition, that the heart attack was just a blip, a story to tell at cocktail parties about how he'd turned things around. Sarah seemed to sense his hesitation. She turned off the engine and took his hand. It's just a house, Mark. It doesn't hold your past. You do. And you can choose what to bring inside with you today. He nodded, took a deep breath, and stepped out of the car. The air smelled of cut grass and blooming jasmine, a scent he realized he hadn't truly noticed in years. He walked slowly up the path, each step deliberate, each breath measured. Sarah unlocked the door and stepped aside, letting him enter first. The house was exactly as he'd left it, and yet completely transformed. The kitchen island where he'd collapsed now held a vase of fresh sunflowers, Sarah's favorite, not his. The briefcase still sat by the stairs, but the Henderson contract had been removed, replaced by a small potted plant Liam had apparently made in art class. The family photos on the mantel seemed to hold new meaning, not as artifacts of a perfect life, but as witnesses to a real one, with all its fractures and repairs. Liam was waiting in the living room, sitting stiffly on the couch, the new robot with reverse capability resting on the cushion beside him. When Mark entered, the boy stood up slowly, his eyes wide. "Hi, Dad," he said softly. "Hi, buddy," Mark replied, his voice catching. He didn't move toward Liam. He waited. Let the boy come to him. Liam took one hesitant step, then another. Then he was running across the room, throwing his small arms around Mark's waist, burying his face in his father's stomach. Mark wrapped his arms around his son, gently, mindful of his healing sternum, and held on as if his life depended on it. Because in a way it did. "I was scared," Liam whispered into his shirt. "I know," Mark said, his own tears falling into his son's hair. "I was scared too. But I'm okay now. And I'm not going anywhere." He didn't make empty promises about never missing another event. He didn't vow to be perfect. He simply held his son and let the truth of his presence speak louder than any pledge. That evening, after Liam had been tucked into bed, after Mark had sat on the edge of the mattress and listened, truly listened, to a 10-minute monologue about the engineering challenges of reverse gear in Lego robots, they sat together on the back porch as the sun set. No phones. No laptops. Just 2 chairs, 2 cups of tea, and the slow descent of twilight. "I start cardiac rehab tomorrow," Mark said, breaking a comfortable silence. 3 times a week for 6 weeks. Sarah nodded, sipping her tea. "I'll drive you." "I know you will." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Robert called this morning. Offered me a 3-month sabbatical. Full pay. No strings." Sarah turned to look at him, her expression unreadable. "What did you say?" "I said yes." He met her gaze squarely. "But not for 3 months. For 6. And not full pay. 50%. Enough to cover the essentials. The rest will adjust." Her eyes widened slightly. "Mark, the mortgage. We'll refinance. Or downsize. Or I'll find a different kind of work when I return, something with boundaries. Something that doesn't demand my soul as collateral." He reached for her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. "Sarah, I spent 20 years building a life I thought would make us happy. And I was wrong. Not because the house is too small or the car isn't nice enough. But because I wasn't in it. I was a ghost haunting my own family. I can't get back the time I lost. But I can choose what I do with the time I have left. And I choose this." He squeezed her hand. "I choose us. However that looks. However much it costs." Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't look away. "Do you mean that? Really mean it? Not just because you had a heart attack and you're scared, but because you've actually changed?" "I don't know if I've changed," he admitted honestly. "Change isn't a switch you flip. It's a practice. A daily choice. But I know this. I'm willing to practice now. I'm willing to be uncomfortable. To feel the anxiety of not checking email. To sit in the silence I used to run from. To be fully present even when it's harder than being productive. That willingness, that's new. That's real." She studied him for a long moment, the last rays of sun catching the gold in her hair. And then she nodded, not with relief, but with something deeper. With hope. "Okay," she said softly. "Let's practice together." The 6 weeks of cardiac rehabilitation became the most transformative period of Mark's life. Not because of the treadmills or the heart rate monitors or the dietary counseling, though those were important, but because of the people he met there. Men and women of all ages, all backgrounds, all brought to this sterile gymnasium by the same failure to listen. A 58-year-old teacher who'd graded papers through chest pain for a week before collapsing at her desk. A 39-year-old nurse who'd worked 3 12-hour shifts in a row during flu season. A 65-year-old retired engineer who'd spent his golden years in furious pursuit of a golf handicap low enough to impress his country club friends. They became an unlikely fellowship of the warned. In the quiet moments between exercises, they shared their stories, not with self-pity, but with the hard-won wisdom of survivors. They spoke of the warnings they'd ignored, the spouse's quiet plea, the body's persistent ache, the child's disappointed eyes, the friend's concerned phone call. They spoke of the moment of collapse, not as tragedy, but as intervention. As the universe's brutal but merciful way of saying, "Enough. Stop. Listen." Mark listened to their stories. And in listening to them, he learned how to listen to himself. He learned to recognize the tightness in his shoulders not as a sign he needed to push harder, but as a signal to pause and breathe. He learned to hear the frantic pace of his thoughts not as productivity, but as anxiety masquerading as ambition. He learned that rest was not laziness. That presence was not passivity. That the most radical act of success in a world obsessed with output might be the courage to simply be. He practiced this new language at home. He sat with Liam for an entire Saturday morning building a robot from scratch, not glancing at his phone once, not mentally drafting emails while his son explained gear ratios. He listened to Sarah describe her day without formulating his response while she was still speaking. He cooked dinner with her, chopping vegetables in comfortable silence, the simple act of creating a meal together feeling more sacred than any boardroom victory. It wasn't perfect. There were days when the old patterns surged back. The phantom vibration of a phone that wasn't there, the compulsive need to check email just once, the anxiety that whispered he was falling behind, that others were getting ahead while he was wasting time on walks and robots and conversations. On those days, he would take out his father's letter and read it again. Or he would place his hand over his heart and feel the steady, miraculous rhythm of a second chance. Or he would look at Liam's drawing still taped to the refrigerator and remember what he had almost lost. The real test came in week 5 of rehab. Robert called, not to check in, but to deliver news. The executive committee position had been offered to someone else. A younger, hungrier vice president who hadn't had a heart attack, who hadn't taken a sabbatical, who was willing to sacrifice everything for the climb. Mark listened to the news without interruption. When Robert finished, he said simply, "I understand. Thank you for telling me." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then Robert's voice, uncharacteristically soft. "You're not even upset?" "I was," Mark admitted honestly. "For about 10 minutes after you hung up. Then I went for a walk. And I realized something. I never actually wanted that job. I wanted what I thought it represented: validation, success, proof that I'd made it. But I've made it, Robert. Just not in the way I thought. I made it home. I made it back to my son. I made it to a place where I can sit on my porch and watch the sunset without thinking about what I should be doing instead. That's a kind of success no title can give you." Another silence. Longer this time. When Robert spoke again, his voice was thick with emotion. "My daughter's fever broke, by the way. She's fine. But sitting by her bed that night, I realized I barely knew her favorite color. I've been so busy building a future for her that I missed her present. I'm taking that cabin trip next week. No phone. No laptop. Just me and her mother." He cleared his throat. "You saved me too, Mark. In a way. Your collapse, it was a warning for me too. Thank you for listening to yours. Maybe it'll help me listen to mine." They hung up. Mark sat for a long time in the quiet of the house, the afternoon sun warming the floorboards beneath his feet. He felt no bitterness about the lost promotion. No regret. Only a profound sense of peace, the quiet certainty that he had not lost anything of value. He had traded a title for his life. And it was, without question, the best deal he had ever made. The final session of cardiac rehab arrived on a crisp autumn morning. The group gathered not in the gymnasium, but in a small conference room with coffee and pastries, a graduation of sorts. One by one, they shared their plans for the future. The teacher was retiring early to write children's books. The nurse was transitioning to part-time hospice care, where presence mattered more than productivity. The engineer had sold his golf clubs and bought a kayak. When it was Mark's turn, he stood slowly, his body stronger than it had been in years, not just physically, but in a way that radiated from some deeper core. "I spent 42 years listening to the wrong voices," he began, his voice steady. The voice that said more was never enough. The voice that equated busyness with worth. The voice that told me I could always make up for lost time tomorrow. I ignored the voices that mattered, the whisper of my own body, the quiet plea of my wife, the hopeful eyes of my son. And I collapsed. Not because I was weak, but because I was strong enough to survive the collapse. Strong enough to hear the warning in its brutal clarity. He looked around the room at the faces of his fellow travelers, these strangers who had become his guides. "I don't have a grand plan. I'm not starting a nonprofit or writing a book or becoming a yoga instructor. I'm just going to be a husband, a father, a man who shows up, who listens, who rests when he's tired, who says no when his soul is full. That's my revolution. That's my legacy. Not what I achieve, but who I am when I'm not achieving anything at all." He sat down to quiet applause, not the thunderous kind, but the soft, knowing kind that comes from people who understand the magnitude of what he just described. The courage it takes to choose an ordinary life lived extraordinarily well. That evening, he and Sarah and Liam sat on the back porch again. The leaves had begun to turn, painting the neighborhood in shades of gold and crimson. Liam was demonstrating his latest robot creation, a complex contraption that could navigate a maze, pick up small objects, and, most impressively, reverse direction when it encountered an obstacle. It learns, Liam explained proudly. When it hits a wall, it doesn't just stop. It backs up and tries a new way. Mark watched his son's face, alight with passion, with pride, with the unself-conscious joy of creation. He felt Sarah's hand find his beneath the table. He looked out at the sunset painting the sky in hues of rose and violet. And he felt it, not happiness, exactly. Something deeper. Something quieter. Contentment. The profound peace of a life aligned with its true purpose. He thought of all the warnings. Sarah's quiet plea at the kitchen island. The hammering of his heart at 3:17 am. Liam's note taped to the robot. Daniel Reeves's visit with the photograph. The Uber driver's wisdom about time. Robert's story of a father choosing his daughter over a deal. His father's letter, written 25 years too late and exactly on time. Dr. Chen's stark truth. The body keeps score. He had not listened. Not at first. Not until the warnings converged into a single, undeniable moment of collapse on a kitchen floor. Not until the universe had to scream to be heard. And this quiet evening on a back porch, this hand in his, this boy explaining the mechanics of resilience with googly-eyed robots, this was what happened after. Not punishment. Not reward. But consequence. The natural outcome of finally, after a lifetime of deafness, learning to listen. He didn't speak. He simply sat in the gathering dusk, breathing slowly, feeling the steady rhythm of his own heart, a rhythm he had almost lost, a rhythm he now cherished not as a machine to be optimized, but as a miracle to be honored. He listened to Liam's excited chatter. He listened to the rustle of leaves in the evening breeze. He listened to the soft rhythm of Sarah's breathing beside him. He listened to the quiet voice inside that no longer whispered of lack and striving, but hummed with a simple, profound truth. This is enough. You are enough. Right here. Right now. He didn't listen. And this hard-won peace, this fragile joy, this second chance blooming like a flower in cracked concrete, this was what happened. Not an ending, but a beginning. The beginning of listening. The beginning of living. The beginning of a life measured not in output, but in presence. Not in what he achieved, but in who he loved and how well he loved them. The sun dipped below the horizon. Stars emerged one by one in the deepening blue. Liam yawned and leaned against his father's shoulder. Sarah's head found its place on his other shoulder. And Mark Reynolds, once a man who measured his worth in deals closed and emails answered, sat perfectly still in the gathering dark, listening to the symphony of a life finally, fully lived. He had not listened. And in the beautiful, terrible, merciful aftermath of that failure, he had learned the most important lesson of all, that the universe does not punish us for our deafness. It simply waits, patient, generous, relentless, until we are ready to hear. And when we finally do, it does not scold us for the time we wasted. It simply welcomes us home, arms open, heart beating in time with our own, whispering the only truth that ever mattered. Welcome back. I've been waiting for you. Now, listen.